Fifth Estate.
Good evening. I'm Eric Malling with a story about a government sting, an informer, and beautiful birds.
The Gyr Falcon. It's the fastest, prettiest killer in the air.
I was dealing with an individual who saw an opportunity to grab a feathered diamond out of the wild and market it.
You abandoned your passport, you skipped out on the charges. If it's all that simple, stay and fight it, prove your innocence.
You give me the money to do it. I mean, it's not prosecution, it's persecution.
I'm Bob McEwen with a story about the survivors of accidents, the lucky ones who are saved by sophisticated emergency medicine and then are forced to live out their lives, brain damaged and rejected.
When they get into severe behavioral problems like David Connor's, the programs don't have resources to deal with these people, so they don't want them. When they get out in the community, the families can't handle these people, and so they don't want them. They don't know what to do.
I am just a curse to my dad, my mom, and sister.
They should have let him die if they can't follow through with programs for a behavioral person like David. Then they should let them die.
And I'm Hannah Gartner with a selection of your letters regarding recent Fifth Estate stories.
It sounds like a spy novel or at least a police thriller. There were thousands of taped phone calls, people were tracked all over the continent, and cars crashed across borders. There was treachery, intrigue, and a government mole. At the heart of it all, not drugs, gangsters, or military secrets. Rather, it was all about birds. Operation Falcon was the largest wildlife enforcement campaign ever mounted in North America. Its target, people who smuggled rare falcons, literally worth their weight in gold, birds that rated their own executive jets to get them halfway around the world. At least 300 conservation officers and policemen were involved, and during one arrest, 14 officers crawled through a window one after another. In the end, however, Mr. Big got away, and from the safety of his perch in Britain, he's laughing at them all.
There used to be gold in the hills of the Yukon, but now there's a new treasure, the Gyr Falcon. It's the fastest, prettiest killer in the air. Once captured and trained for falconry like this bird, it's a precious commodity, a status symbol in the hotter skies of Saudi Arabia, where many Canadian falcons now fly.
The birds didn't just fly on down from the Canadian Arctic and over to the deserts of Saudi Arabia. In fact, the way they got there has been part of a 6-week trial here in Whitehorse, the longest trial in Yukon history, in which 7 people were charged with conspiracy. It was one of the last legal actions in a 4-continent, 7-year investigation by Canadian and U.S. authorities called Operation Falcon.
Birds of prey are protected. It's illegal to capture and sell a wild bird. Birds bred in captivity can be sold, but who knows which is which? This man was directed to infiltrate the bird smuggling rings in North America. Falconer Jeff McPartland of Great Falls, Montana, was at the center of Operation Falcon. He had been a radio station manager, and now he's in real estate. But for 3 years, Jeff McPartland was codenamed T1, working as a full-time undercover agent for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Back in 1970 in Wyoming, McPartland was caught arranging to sell illegal falcons to Saudi Arabia. He pleaded guilty and turned state's evidence in that case. Now, in Operation Falcon, Jeff McPartland was even more deeply involved in the illegal sale of birds of prey, but this time on the right side of the law.
Ordinary police work, where we put the man in a green uniform and a Smokey the Bear hat out onto the Canadian tundra or the Arctic tundra in Alaska and say, you watch the Gyr Falcon nest, somebody might come by to take the young birds. That doesn't work. We have people that were involved in illegal take of these birds of prey that are extremely knowledgeable in the habits of the birds. They have the very best of climbing equipment. They have the knowledge of where the nests are.
Many of the gyrfalcon nests are in the cliffs of the Yukon. A rough estimate is maybe 700 to 800 breeding pairs. At the Yukon Game Farm outside Whitehorse, they breed elk for zoos around the world, but 2/3 of their income comes from breeding falcons. Danny Nolan owns the farm. In Operation Falcon, the authorities said he was stealing wild birds. He said he bred and raised them here. Nolan says much of his breeding technique has to do with diet. Today, the birds are getting chicken. Usually it's quail, raised on the farm and fed to them to encourage their courting ritual, a birdie version of steak and champagne. For 3 years, Nolan hasn't been able to sell his birds. They've been under house arrest. But he keeps rearing them under the watchful eyes of the authorities.
They certainly saw the eggs, each one that was laid. If one was moved, they marked it. If it was moved from an incubator to a chicken, they marked it was recorded. If it was moved back from the chicken to the falcons, it was recorded.
They could actually see the little beaks coming out of the eggs.
They saw them pipping, they saw them hatching. There isn't any question about that. And if they left here with any question in their mind, of which they tell me there is no question,
that you can breed gyrfalcons.
That's right.
The man who got away from Operation Falcon was John Slater, an Englishman who started Canada's first school of falconry. In happier days, Slater got a lot of attention for his school in Cambridge, Ontario.
No, turn your hand. You're turning your hand towards him so he can see the meat down there. Now put your hand there.
But what made Slater different in Canadian falconry was his contacts, a considerable acquaintance among Arab sheiks.
Some of the good Arab falconers are the best I've ever seen. And their attitude towards the bird, how do you know what a beautiful woman is? How do you know what a beautiful horse is? I mean, are all horses the same? You've got a nice-looking horse and another one that's not so good.
And the Arabs have an eye.
They have an eye for a falcon, and it's a thing, it's an innate thing in them.
For a Saudi prince making millions of dollars a day from oil, it's a joy to spend $20,000, even $50,000 to own the bird, which strikes its prey at 300 kilometers an hour. To sell to the Arabs, a Canadian falcon exporter must be able to meet a government requirement. Export permits are issued only for captive-bred birds. Wild falcons cannot legally be sold abroad. The permit system is supposed to protect the wild birds. The flaw is that the Arabs won't pay the big bucks for birds bred in captivity.
People in the Middle East don't like these birds. A lot of them talk, as they say, scream. They drive you demented. You know, they really, really rasp on your ears. They're terrible, and they're bad manners, like a spoilt child, because when you feed them, they're what they call footy. They grab and bite. They've got no manners. It's like an ill-bred person.
Who can tell the difference between a captive-bred falcon and a wild falcon? Before Operation Falcon, wildlife officers used to depend on the breeder's word. Usually, they'd just hand over export permits on demand. Ontario Conservation Officer Peter Meervelt used to deal with exporter John Slater.
It was because of the ease in getting permits that we did crack down on it.
Well, maybe you guys have a lot to answer for, too. Are you such pansies that John Slater can come in and say, I want this, I want that, no questions asked, and end up shipping birds?
Originally, I would say that I wouldn't call us pansies, but certainly we weren't aware of all the problems. It was a very, very new and unique case for us. And bird smuggling was very new in Canada. And we were made aware of it, and we certainly did investigate.
They certainly did. Falconer Jeff McPartland in Montana became the center of the largest North American wildlife enforcement effort ever. The joint Canadian-U.S. investigation was codenamed Operation Falcon, a government sting. At $2,000 a month from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, McPartland's assignment was to commit crimes. The authorities gave him the go-ahead to catch wild falcons. He bought more from certain Canadians. Then he told the world that he had the most valuable wild birds for sale.
People came to me to buy these birds. People came to me and offered me vast sums of money if I would work for them. They had breeding projects, they claimed. The breeding projects were fronts. They told me that what they would do was take eggs or babies out of the wild, run them through the breeding projects, get bans on the birds from the authorities, and then sell them. But they also told me that the nestling birds raised in captivity did not have the commercial value in the Middle East of the wild-trapped falcons, particularly the wild-trapped Arctic gerfalcons.
The Operation Falcon trap was sprung like a big drug bust at bird breeding operations such as the Yukon Game Farm.
The Mounties and Game Wardens swooped in here at 6 o'clock in the morning on June 29th, 1984, the day of the big takedown. The raids against falconers were synchronized across 3 time zones in 4 provinces and 14 states. The haul at the end of that morning, 106 birds, 6 pickup trucks, 3 sedans, 1 aircraft, and in the U.S., as a little bonus, $3,100 in counterfeit bills and 5 pounds of marijuana.
For one Yukoner, Operation Falcon must have seemed like a Keystone Cops operation. One of the 10 people in the Yukon charged with conspiracy to buy and sell wildlife was David Mossop, the Yukon government's own expert on birds of prey. He's worked out of Whitehorse for 10 years and spends much of his time in lonely parts of the north looking for and after birds. In the early 1980s, concerned that eggs were being stolen from falcon nests, he went to the RCMP. But when Operation Falcon hit the Yukon, it was Mossop, the wildlife biologist, who was charged along with the rest. But after 2 years, the Crown just stayed his charges.
There's no question I was badly hurt. My career has been damaged. There's no question about that. But I don't like to even concentrate on it. For me, that's not the issue. The issue is that resource out there. And managing those birds is what, I'm a wildlife biologist, that's what I am. My concern is for those birds out on the land, and the effect on the conservation program is the real issue as far as I'm concerned.
So when you hear Operation Falcon?
Operation Dragnet.
And what's it done to your efforts to try and save these birds?
It's put us back probably at least 10 years.
But Operation Falcon was made for headlines. There were gripping reports of multi-million-dollar smuggling rings, beautiful birds, and rich Arabs. Canada's most wanted bird smuggler now divides his time between Britain and Saudi Arabia. There are still 37 criminal charges against John Slater for violations of the Export and Import Permits Act, but Slater jumped bail. Indeed, the man who once boasted that the end price for this gerfalcon had been $135,000 in Saudi Arabia now says the value of the birds to the Arabs has been exaggerated.
This thing about Arabia is blown up out of proportion. If you've got a buyer, you've got a seller, you've got a buyer in anything. You can't sell anything to anyone which they don't want.
Oh, but one hears about, $100,000.
It's lies.
Being paid for a bird from Canada.
It is lies. It is lies.
How much have you heard of a bird going for there?
The most I've heard for a bird is under a third of that.
I sat with Slater. I watched the man as he brought out a stack of bogus permits. He said, "What does it matter? The bird is dead. The permit lives on. The Canadian Wildlife Service ban lives no matter whether the bird lives or not. The band keeps the bird alive." It was the money. It was the money that he talked about. It wasn't the welfare of the birds.
How much money for Slater?
Over $750,000 in just over 16 months.
Like all informers, Jeff McPartland is now an outcast. Expelled from the North American Falconers Association, he's been attacked as the one who created illegal activity rather than preventing it. He's still worried about retribution against his birds. And when his role in Operation Falcon was first disclosed, he says there were threats against him, too.
One example was, "You won't live to go to trial." Another one is, "There's no place for you to hide. It's not over. It'll never be over. You're dead."
Take any of it seriously?
I think you have to when somebody says they're going to kill you. I think it's kind of prudent to consider that it's possible.
The birds seized in the raids across the U.S. were brought to McPartland's home in Montana. Each bird went through the usual criminal identification process. Then the precious federal evidence was kept under heavy security. Indeed, there was an around-the-clock armed guard for the birds and for McPartland. Although their command post had an arsenal including shotguns and M16s, a summer camp atmosphere set in. The team of Fish and Wildlife agents even brought out their own T-shirts to commemorate their memorable tour of duty. There were no jokes, though, at Ontario's African Lion Safari. John Slater worked here for a year setting up a birds of prey exhibit. That brief association brought the entire bird breeding operation at the safari under suspicion. 45 charges of illegal importing and exporting were laid against James Daly, who runs the safari. His 46 birds of prey were seized, not to be moved or sold. 3 years and $55,000 later, the charges were simply dropped.
Well, when we first were faced with Operation Falcon and the original seizures, we were sort of led to believe that the intent was the protection of birds of prey in general and endangered species in particular. But the more we dealt with the people that were involved with it and sort of discovered what was going on behind the scenes, we found that there was no genuine concern for the birds, and there seemed to be a very heightened concern for really a media event produced by relatively few individuals with enforcement. And it's basically virtually put us out of business for the past 3 years in any of our demonstrations and breeding of our raptors at the African Lion Safari.
Finding nice investments in the British countryside for his Arab friends is keeping John Slater busy these days. He's the only one who fled. But he was enraged when the British press called him Mr. Big, and he says Operation Falcon was a farce.
I bought birds on behalf of someone else and exported them in 1984. Now, I couldn't leave...
After you'd been charged?
After I'd been charged, I couldn't leave Ontario, as I would have gone myself.
How did you get the permits?
Well, I sent somebody else there, asked him if he had birds for sale, the name and where they're going to in Arabia, which was the same address on the license that was previous, which was at the Yukon Game Farm in '82, and they were shipped.
So you're telling me that after you were charged, you were able to keep doing the same thing, exporting birds in exactly the same way?
I exported one lot of birds, yes.
Were they wild birds?
No.
They were bred birds?
The permit said captive bred.
Haha, the permit said. Easy to get a permit? What do you have to do? What do you have to do other than just declare whatever you want to say it is?
I don't declare nothing. I have bought the birds with the permit. The breeder gets the permit. He makes the declaration. He knows if he bred a bird or not. Not me.
Not so, said Slater's former partner, Canadian Glenn Luckman. He blew the whistle on Slater and pleaded guilty himself. He was fined $25,000 in the U.S. and $20,000 in Canada. He stayed out of jail by agreeing to testify for the RCMP and was their star witness in the Yukon. Luckman said in court that falcons trapped in the wild were laundered through the Yukon Game Farm. But after a 6-week trial, a Yukon jury said they didn't believe him. Danny Nolan was acquitted.
What do you think's behind all this?
What's behind it all?
What started it all?
I believe it started all in the United States. And I think it started with the Fish and Wildlife Service, who wanted a bigger budget, and the way to do it was create this multi-million-dollar international smuggling ring. And guess who started the international smuggling ring? Guess who phoned up Luckman, and guess who phoned up Slater and said, bring me birds, and I'll pay you? No other than Jeff McPartland, an undercover agent who was caught twice by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service and pressed into action for them.
What about the falconers who claim that most of the illegality here was started by you?
Maybe people got to pull their heads out and take a look at the resource around them and decide whether they want to put a value on that resource or go ahead and take the DeLorean stance of anybody can yell entrapment. My God, you can go down the road. Anybody can say, he made me do it. You weren't there. The people watching this program weren't there. In many cases, I was. I know what I was told. I know what the deal was. They were guilty, and they were not entrapped.
Jeff McPartland much official recognition for his contribution to American wildlife, even though the only proven smuggling from the U.S. included McPartland's and the government's birds. In total so far, some 60 Americans have been convicted or have pleaded guilty to various misdemeanors. Saudi Prince Bader bin Abdulaziz paid a fine of $150,000 to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service because of his role in buying illegal gyrfalcons. In Canada, Operation Falcon has hurt the breeding establishments like the Yukon Game Farm.
What's this whole trial done to you and done to the game farm?
Well, it put me out of business. It broke me to the point of where I went about $240,000 in debt, and the only way I can recover and pay my bills is by selling out.
Because you couldn't sell birds and you had, what, $100,000 in legal fees?
That's right.
So Danny Nolan puts his place up for sale, and that's a blow to the Yukon government trying to get captive birds on the market so people won't have to steal wild ones. Now, after Operation Falcon, breeders fear that Mounties, instead of buyers, will be coming to call.
The Fifth Estate will return.